starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi everyone and welcome to today's CECAN webinar. My name is Gail and I'm one of the CECAN Centre Managers. Today's webinar is about risk analysis at the Food Standards Agency post-EU exit, the role of economics and social science in informing risk management. Our speaker is Vanna Aldin, who is Head of Analytics and Chief Economist at the Food Standards Agency. Vanna is going to speak to us for around 45 minutes and then we'll have some time for Q&A. Please submit your questions via the question box, which you should be able to see on the webinar control panel. And please feel free to submit those questions at any point during the webinar today. The session will be recorded and will be made available on the CECAN website afterwards, along with the slides. So I will now hand over to Vanna for today's presentation.
Thanks, Gail.
No problem.
So I'm Vanna Aldin. I'm the Chief Economist and Head of Analytics at the Food Standard Agency. I've been working at the Food Standard Agency for the last 3.5 years, and prior to that, I've been working as a senior economist for the Home Office, mainly on migration issues, and at the Office for National Statistics, mainly working on productivity. So today I'm going to talk to you about the risk analysis that we are putting in place in the Food Standard Agency in preparation for EU exit. And I will talk a little bit about the role of economics and social science in informing risk management as it will be developed for when we will leave the EU. So we'll give a brief overview of the Food Standard Agency, what is our role, what we do. I will talk a little bit about the food and feed safety risk analysis process that we are developing. And I will talk about the role of economic science in along other legitimate factors that will be taken into account by the risk managers alongside risk assessment in order to protect public health and wider consumers' interest in relation to food. And then there will be a brief session to address any question that you might have. So the Food Standard Agency is a non-ministerial government department that is being set up back in 2000 with an act of parliament to protect the public health and consumers' interest in relation to food. It's governed by a board, so we don't have ministers, and day-to-day management of FSA is delegated to officials from the chief executive. And it is the board that ensures that the Food Standard Agency fulfill its legal obligation so that the public can be reassured that decisions take proper account of scientific advice, interests of consumers, and other relevant factors. The law and regulation that are mainly concerned with the Food Standard Agency are listed here. And in addition to the Food Safety Act, established in 1990 and as amended, provide the framework for all the food legislation in Britain. We are mainly base all the regulation on the General Food Law Regulation, that is EU legislation, and provide the general principle for food safety and traceability of food. I'll talk a little bit about the division of responsibility of food law in the UK, and it will become clear later in the presentation why this is important. So the feed and food safety standards are devolved matters in the UK. The FSA responsibility in the central government, as the main body for food safety law in England, Wales, and Northern Ireland. However, for Scotland, back in 2015, a Food Standard Scotland was established as the national food body for responsibility just in Scotland. So the food law guide doesn't include the details on food law in Scotland now. And due to a change of machinery in government, since 2010, the FSA responsibility for food law across England and Wales and Northern Ireland is no more harmonized. This is because since then, DEFRA is responsible for food labeling in England, and the Department for Health and Social Care is responsible for nutrition-related food legislation. In Wales, the Food Standard Agency, we have retained responsibility for food labeling, but the Welsh Government is responsible for nutrition, whereas in Northern Ireland, the FSA still retains responsibility for food labeling and nutrition. So it's a little bit complicated. So at the moment, is the FSA is part, as we are still part of the European Union, risk assessment and risk management are separated, and the European Food Safety Authority is responsible for risk assessment. So EFSA produced scientific opinion and advice inform European policy and legislation and to support the European Commission and European Parliament. EFSA works in close collaboration with national authorities, including with FSA. So I'm going to briefly remind the three main components of risk analysis. Probably most of you will be familiar already. So in the risk analysis process, there are three components: risk assessment, risk management, and risk communication. So risk assessment is the science and is a scientifically based process that consisted of the four international recognized standards: hazard identification, hazard characterization, exposure assessment, and risk characterizations. Then we have the risk management, which is the process of waiving policy alternative in consultation with all interest parties and considering risk assessment and other factors that are relevant for the health protection of consumers and the further promotion of fair trade practice. As part of the risk analysis process, we have risk communication, which is an interactive process of exchanging information and opinion throughout the entire process, making sure that risk factors and risk perceptions among risk assessors, risk managers, consumers, industry, and academia community are taken into account and are explaining, including the explanation of the basis of why risk managers have reached specific decisions. So on the basis of that, we are working on a food and feed safety risk analysis process that will help us ensure the high standards of food safety and consumer protection we currently enjoy in the UK is maintained when the UK leaves the EU. And this flowchart gives you all the steps from risk identification up to the decision made by FSA in terms of risk management advice to ministers, which we plan to go through to ensure that is evidence-based, is science-based, and transparent. So here we have 12 steps, and are all related to either risk management and risk assessment. And risk communication runs for all of them, essentially. But at specific steps, we wanted to ensure that we maintain the principle of transparency and evidence-based by publishing and make it all available to everyone to understand how the decisions were made. So we started with a risk identification process to all the activities that are necessary to decide whether or not further action is appropriate. And if it is, we have the problem formulation. And the problem formulation is where risk assessors and risk managers agree what is the evidence that is required to inform a potential risk assessment and other evidence that would help risk managers to make decisions. There is then the internal process of gathering the and analyze the evidence, providing quality assurance, and then presenting all the package of risk assessment and other evidence to risk managers, where at this point we plan also to publish. Then is the responsibility of risk managers to assess to weigh all the evidence and particularly the risk assessment and other legitimate factors that they should take into account. And then we're working on a structure that will try to replicate the current setup that we have in the UK in terms of the 4 countries, responsibilities as well, in order to develop an advice that ensure consistency across the 4 countries. And then once the advice is formulated, and if it is necessary, it goes for formal consultation, we'll then publish and with a supporting evidence once it's given to ministers to make the final decision. So what we are doing in FSA to ensure that this process of the new risk analysis is going to work. We have already agreed back in December the overarching principle that will guide the entire risk analysis process. And they are mainly three. One is that the process must be open and transparent. So that's why we said, as I said, we publish the advice we provide to others and the analysis and the evidence on which the advice was based. The advice and recommendation presented to ministers will be risk, science, and evidence-based and independent. And third, the risk analysis process should have the capacity to provide for a 4-country model and deliver, where appropriate, unified food and feed safety risk management recommendation for the UK. In order to achieve that, and following best international standards, we are putting in place a functional separation of risk assessment and risk management internally in FSA. Until recently, the risk managers, policy people, and the risk assessors and analysts were part of the same directorate, accountable to one director of policy and science. We are now functionally separated, so we have created two divisions, one exclusively policy, so risk assessors, and one of science, which we include the risk assessors and the rest of analysts responsible to a separate director. We are working on the operating procedure for the risk analysis process that I just described, and we are working alongside other government departments and board administrations, and in particular working closely with the Department of Health and Social Care, DEFRA, and we're relevant with the Department for International Trade. And the operating procedure will include the links to existing framework and guidance from our Scientific Advisory Committee, international recognized organization as well, and appropriate procedure for establishing priority for risk assessment and risk management interventions. And also for all the type of analysis that we will need to be assessed, including the other legitimate factors that risk managers would like to take into account. And we are working within our risk assessment unit to build the capability internally and strengthening the FSA Scientific Advisory Committee capacity, and also to provide the required access to external expertise. So we've been just working to, we just advertised for expanding the capacity in the Scientific Advisory Committees, and we are currently running a recruiting campaign to invite academics and experts to join a register of experts for FSA that provide the means to give us quick, reliable access when is needed to expertise to cover areas that we are not responsible for at the moment. We are developing a risk management structure. As I mentioned earlier, we need to provide assurance that we will be able to cover the 4 countries. So the plan is to create an advisory forum on food and feed, which will provide a cohesive UK risk management options on matter of food and feed, and it will consider all the risk management recommendations developed by Food Standard Agency and Food Standard Scotland to ensure that we provide protect public health and consumers' interests in relation to food and food safety across the UK. We have already published the underlying terms of reference for the advisory forum on food and feed, which will include membership from not only FSA and Food Standard Scotland, but also appropriate representation from other relevant departments such as DEFRA, Department of Health and Social Care, DIT, the Department for International Trade, and for the administrations. And we are working on defining on the role of all the members with overarching principle that we want to ensure that independence of the Food Safety Authority is still there, while allowing department to assure themselves that necessary science and technical contribution to the risk analysis process produced by FSA and FSS are taken into account. And then we are developing a transparent process for economic and social science evidence being considered by risk managers, what is usually called by international standards the other legitimate factors. So what will change is that we as analysts will be involved at the beginning of the process, particularly on step 3, when risk assessors and risk managers will look at the problem formulations. So we will be there as well to ensure that other evidence that is required can be produced by us. And when we're talking about economics and social science evidence, we just wanted to ensure that while the risk assessment is related to public health of consumers, we ensure that we are considering the wider consumer's interest in relation to food, which is the main objective of having Food Standard Agency. We also look at consumer preference, acceptability, a perception of risk, and we will provide cost-benefit analysis to understand economic and social science impact. And in a certain sense, it's not that we haven't been doing this before. We had, because it's a requirement in the UK to produce impact assessment and to consider, especially for any regulatory change, and to provide, to ensure that policymakers understand the consequence of a proposed intervention. So we've been doing impact assessments in FSA already for a long time. The difference it will be that within a more structured risk analysis process, we will identify at the beginning all other legitimate factors that needed to be taken into account by the risk managers, and it will be also transparent in the way that we will bring together the evidence. So a core part of the risk analysis process will be around the risk assessment. And that is very important for us because most of the risk assessments are currently done by the European Food Safety Authority. So we are strengthening our capability and capacity internally to ensure that we are able to provide risk-based standards and for risk-based standards and controls, the right assurance from UK perspective, and that potentially include reviewing EU risk assessment and providing support to trade discussions. And for regulated products, we will need to build the capability from scratch in order to produce a national risk assessment, to inform approvals and post-market reviews of the food safety of regulated products, which currently are done only by the European Food Safety Authority. So, in order to be able to do that, we need to strengthen the capability of a scientific advisory committee. And here is a brief illustration of what we currently have. And this is only the scientific advisory committee that provides risk assessment advice. So we hope that by beginning of April, we will have expanded some of the committee capacity and at least access to a required external expertise to provide us with independent scientific-based advice from the register of experts. Another step which is extremely important is to ensure, and on which we are working at the moment, is to ensure that there is a process to quality assure the risk assessment advice, both the one produced internally and the one provided by independent scientific advisory committee. So we'll have a science council, and the chief scientific advisor will provide this quality assurance role. Prior to submitting the evidence package to the risk managers. And in the last steps of the risk analysis process, we want to be as transparent as possible. So the risk manager will use the evidence that we will provide to them to consider, to weigh different options. They will engage from the advisory forum on food and feed with the devolved administrations and other government departments, and then we will consult with our board for issues where of strategic policy or complexity, and finally the advisor will be presented to ministers with the idea that in the last steps it will be all published and transparent, evidence-based. So this is the work that we are planning to do. Are there any questions?
Thank you, Vanna. And if anyone does have any questions, could you please submit those via the control panel? There is a section there for questions. Vanna, so we've had one question just come in, and the question is, what are the benefits of having a separate risk assessment and risk management functions?
Okay. The benefits are in providing reassurance that the risk assessment will be science-based. The risk managers will need to take into consideration other factors in making their decisions, but as principles already agreed in international organizations like the Codex Alimentarius and WHO, it is extremely important that risk assessment consider only the impacts on public health. And we shouldn't take any other things into consideration in making their assessment. However, risk managers have a duty to consider other factors, particularly around other consumers' interests, and weigh all of them in order to come up with a policy decision. What is important, the separation provides a reassurance about the independence of risk assessments and free from interference from other factors that risk managers should take actually into account.
Thanks, Vanna. We've also had a few more questions come in. So the next one is, could you give an example of a concrete case in which machine learning was used to inform risk policy?
Machine learning, no, I don't think we have been using machine learning so far. We've been trying to use for helping local authorities are our enforcement agency in food and feed safety. So they do inspect food business to ensure that food business are compliant with food and safety regulation and food standards regulation. We've been trying to look at the data that local authorities collect to see if we can help them to have a more risk-based approach rather than one size fits all in the way they deliver inspection. But I think we are still at an early stage in that space.
Thank you. And one other question that we've had come in is, what do you foresee being the biggest risks to the UK consumer of leaving the EU in terms of food safety?
Big risk to the consumers. That's a good question. We wanted to, we are working really hard to ensure that we maintain the same level of food safety consumers have been enjoying so far as part of when the UK was part of the EU. So our main objective is working towards maintaining the same level of safety. it's difficult to say at this level, given at this time, given the level of uncertainty on how we're going to leave the EU in the coming weeks and months. But the long-term aim is to ensure that from the early stage in terms of surveillance and risk identification, we put in place the systems in the UK that provide the same level of reassurance to the consumers.
Thank you. And one final question which has just arrived is, where could we find data sets which are relevant to food safety analysis?
Data set. Can you be... we do publish, most of our data sets are publicly available. We do publish the data from local authorities as well in terms of incidents. Is anything specifically that you are looking for?
Perhaps with that one, for the person who asked that question, if you'd like to send over any more details, if you could email that to us, then we'll forward it over to Vanna after the webinar. Does that sound okay for you, Vanna?
Yes, that's perfect.
Great. Okay.
Yeah, because I don't think there is a specific data set on food safety, but we're very keen to make as much data available as possible. So there is quite a lot on our website. And if the participant can be more specific on the question, I'm very happy to help.
Great. Thanks, Vanna. One last question which has come in. So similarly to the question on machine learning, is social research playing a role in providing evidence for your risk assessment?
Yes. So it's not for the risk assessment. As I said before, the risk assessors usually look at the implication of on public health and risk related to health. We do quite a lot of research, both internally and by commissioning externally, on understanding consumers' attitude, preference, and perception of risks. So as I said before, it's not something that we are looking to do from scratch as we leave the EU to inform risk managers' decision. So to give you an example, recently that we look into it was unpasteurized drink milk. Probably if you look at raw drinking milk is more common. We recently did a risk assessment, and in order for the policy to reach a decision on whether or not to allow consumers to access unpasteurized milk, the risk managers consider other evidence. So alongside the potential economic impacts, the preference and choice of consumers, and the decision was not only based on purely on risk assessment, but was based on different factors, including social factors.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Vanna. So I think that probably brings us to the end of today's webinar. As we mentioned earlier, we will be making the recording and the slides available on our website in the coming days. And we'd like to thank everyone for dialing in. And Yeah, that's it for today. So I hope everyone has a good afternoon and take care.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yeah.